Into the ether here. Let's let our folks in. Admit everyone. Hey, welcome everyone. Welcome to Piano Tech Radio Hour today. This is Ethan Janney. We'll get started momentarily with the show. Spotlight myself, spotlight our guest for today. Do some introductions soon for those of you that are joining us for the first time. And then we'll get into the conversation. Want to welcome you here. If you're out on their socials like YouTube and Facebook, you can join us directly on the Zoom call that we're having live right now. Unless you're watching the rebroadcast, you should be able to do that. We'll put a link into the chat so that you can join if you want to. Just a little registration link, and then you'll be able to pop in and say hi. We welcome your questions and comments, whether you're in the Zoom call or not. You're welcome to text things into the YouTube or Facebook chat, and we'll try to address those things. If you're in the Zoom call, you might even have the opportunity to come on audio or video and participate in the discussion. No pressure, but that's always fun if there's something to talk about. And then I'll go ahead and do an official introduction here to the program so that you know where you're at and what you're up to today, and we'll get started. So I will welcome you to Piano Tech Radio Hour. What we do is we gather here every Saturday to meet with and learn from the most fascinating and knowledgeable folks in the piano world, including manufacturers, rebuilders, musicians, makers of other instruments, and of course, piano techs. Our mutual goal is to become better at our craft, to help each other, and to create an ever more musical world together. Piano Tech Radio Hour is brought to you by Piano Technicians Masterclasses, an online learning resource that brings you cutting-edge instruction from piano industry masters without leaving your home. You could find out more at pianotechniciansmasterclass.com. You can also subscribe to Piano Tech Radio Hour for just $16 a month and get direct access to each week's private Zoom call, as well as all the archival recordings of over 200 episodes in our member area. You can join using the link bit.ly/joinptrh, bit.ly/joinptrh. And then also it's useful to get a little housekeeping up front to let you know about some other things going on. The podcast you can find at pianotechradio.com, or release just the audio versions of this content for review. We'll release some archival content and some of our newer content. You can also check out our blog at pianotechniciansmasterclass.substack.com. That will give you previews of our member area only content. This isn't the radio hour, this is the master classes where we talk about things like piano regulation, voicing, rebuilding, all that cool, hard to find information. Our blogs will give you a sneak peek into that info. Valuable stuff which you can take and apply in many cases with even images and descriptions of things. And if it looks really good to you, you can always click and sign up and access that lecture in our member area. And then make sure you visit our social medias. We've got YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. It's usually Piano Tech Masterclass or something similar. You should be able to find us. All right, let's go ahead and make an introduction to our guest today. We're excited to have Michael Stanley. He is a talented conductor, French horn player, and music educator based in Los Angeles, California. He's played at some of the most iconic venues, Carnegie Hall, Walt Disney Concert Hall. Right now, he is the music director and conductor for the Burbank Philharmonic Orchestra and the Westlake Village Symphony. Known for his lively and engaging conducting style, Michael has led orchestras across the U.S. and around the globe. He's also a big supporter of new music, having commissioned and premiered a wide variety of pieces. Additionally, to his performance career, he is deeply committed to music education. He directs the Burbank Philharmonic's Discovery Conductor Project, which focuses on mentoring young aspiring conductors. His dedication to education has earned him accolades, including recognition as Teacher of the Year for his impactful work in the field. Michael, welcome to Piano Tech Radio Hour. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me, Ethan. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's great to have a little touch base with the LA area today. In fact, recently I was in the Bay Area, in San Francisco, a little bit north. We were exploring some of the music and piano scene there. with some footage from my personal visit. And of course, I do have a bit of a connection with Los Angeles. Know a lot of musicians, composers, creatives in that area. It's a thriving, of course, area in entertainment. It's not just the movies and television. There's arts and music and all sorts of other cool things going on.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here.
So, are you a Los Angeles native, or did you find yourself there as a career move? How did it turn out that you've become such an integral part of Los Angeles?
Well, in actuality, I was born on the East Coast. I was born in Lynchburg, Virginia, and but my family moved to Southern California when I was, in elementary school, and I basically grew up and did all my education here in the LA area. I did my undergrad in French horn at UCLA. I studied with Rick Todd, the eminent studio horn player, which was a great experience. And I still play to this day, which is something I really appreciate and enjoy being able to do. And I also have then studied, since then I've studied conducting for a master's, and I am this close to having my doctorate post in conducting real soon.
Awesome, that's great. How have you found the doctorate in music? I feel like it's a great opportunity to just become very focused. What prompted you to say, you know what, let's go for the doctorate?
Well, I think several things prompted me. One is just the idea that I want to go as far as I can in my education. So I always had an idea that I eventually wanted to get a doctorate just to, prove to myself I could do it and to go to that highest level that I could go to. And I also originally started it thinking, I might want to teach in the university or college someday. So that in today's world is pretty much a prerequisite just to kind of get in the door. So, but I'm finding that I really also enjoy very much just the professional work that I'm doing right now. So, I will appreciate having the doctorate. It's enabled me to go really in depth on conducting, on certain composers, styles of music, things like that. And it led me to a really interesting doctoral project that I'm working on right now, which I think is going to be of benefit, to the greater orchestral world. So for that alone, I'm really glad that I did it.
That's great. How do you how did you come about the doctoral project? How long's the program been? Is it, is it this thing where you're sort of searching for the topic and then you find it and you kind of go for it? Is it something you started with an interest in and then you kind of knew your topic up front? How did that
No,
thesis
I
topic
really
evolve for
didn't.
you?
Even with my master's, I came in with one idea and then I ended up switching to something else. For my master's, I did a really interesting, I wanted to focus on Histoire de Soldat, which is notoriously one of the hardest conducting pieces. And I thought, well, I'm going to challenge myself to learn this really hardest piece to conduct. But along the way, what I've discovered is I have a real interest in like oral history and sort of the history of how things come about. So I decided for that one, I ended up focusing on the three recordings of it that Stravinsky himself conducted, the third of which was done here in Los Angeles in the late 60s. And I managed to track down some of the players that played on that recording under him.
Hmm.
And after I interviewed them, they actually came to my recital. So the first half of the recital was a panel discussion. We had Bill Kraft, the percussionist, and Roy D'Antonio, the clarinetist. And they came and did I would say, a pretty hysterical discussion, the two of them going back and forth. And they were able to share anecdotes about what it was like to work with Stravinsky. So
Wow.
that's one thing that I'm interested in. But in this project, I didn't start with this in mind.
Let's pause there. I want to hear about this other project, but this
Oh,
this opens up some interesting conversation. Yeah, um, I mean, the biggest thing I know about Stravinsky, and just for a little bit about my background, I've studied jazz piano performance. I definitely have some foundational classical music studies. A little bit of Beethoven and Mozart, and you know, um, a little bit of exposure to various things, especially through this program. But I'm not an expert in classical. My biggest association with Stravinsky is that uh, sort of impactful story, that when they were playing the Rite of Spring for the very first times, people were rioting, and the
mhm.
new sounds were so incredible they could hardly bear it. So that tells me something interesting, about Stravinsky and the type of character, the type of music. Is
Mhm.
there anything you could share, from those panels that you learned, or interesting stories, or things that came up in that process?
Yeah, yeah. In some ways, I kind of set out to debunk the myth. Stravinsky was famous for saying, "Don't interpret my music. Just play what it
Okay.
says." He didn't want, what he really meant is don't interpret it badly.
Okay.
Because I was able to find research and interviews with his son, Sulima, who actually became a piano professor at, I think it was Indiana, who said, "No, my dad taught me to interpret music all the time. We would do phrasing and he would add things that weren't in the score. But I kind of had this idea that, there's no way Stravinsky could be that robotic." So I compared the three recordings. The first one was from the 30s, and then he had another one in the 50s, I think, and the last one was done, with studio players. And I just clocked all the tempos and went like, yeah, he wasn't consistent throughout, which I expected, because he's
Hmm.
human. And I wanted to show, yeah, he's a great musician. He really just meant don't mess up my music by interpreting it badly. And
Hmm.
the biggest thing I got from talking to those players was that because of who he was, his presence was more impactful than any conducting gestures he may or may not have been able to do, because he was known to not necessarily be the best conductor. And then there was the whole controversy with Robert Kraft, who towards the end of his life, Robert Kraft started ghost conducting some of the recordings, and then they would put Stravinsky's name as the conductor when in fact Kraft had conducted some or all of it.
Hmm.
And this is something that Bill Kraft, the no relation, the percussionist, was really on about, because he had not appreciated Robert Kraft's influence on Stravinsky and was upset that this had been done, this sort of switcheroo thing with the
Hmm.
names. But both Bill Kraft and Roy D'Antonio were really adamant about, first of all, it was Stravinsky, and by the 60s, Stravinsky was God. So you like whatever he said, you would do. Roy D'Antonio told a funny story about whenever Stravinsky would stop and say something, they would all pick up their pencils, whether they needed to or not, pretend to write, and then clank it down on the stand as loud as possible so that Stravinsky knew they had paid attention to what he said, whether they needed to write it or not. But they just said, his presence there on the podium was such that even if the gestures weren't great, they would be able to, that would raise their performance level by just being his presence being in front of them on the podium, which
Hmm.
again is kind of what I thought, because he's such a musical powerhouse that just being able to play under him was a real honor for all of those people, and they tried their absolute best. I mean, D'Antonio told another story about a live performance of Histoire that they did, I think, at the Wilshire Evil Theater or something like that. And he said, man, they rehearsed it at a certain tempo, and then in the performance, Stravinsky went way faster. And he's like, I just put my head down, played my heart out, and when it was over, I couldn't get up from the chair. I was so exhausted mentally and physically from having. But he's like, if that's what the boss wants, that's what we're going to give the boss.
Hmm. That's fascinating. Yeah, I often think about the sort of four stages of learning. You could apply this to what you're talking about here. You have the unconscious incompetence. You're not good at something, but you're so bad you don't even know how bad you are. Then you have your conscious competence, where you're learning how to do it, so you kind of see the places where you're falling short and fix them consciously. Then you have the conscious competence. I'm actually good at this, but I got to think about it. And then you have the unconscious competence, which is kind of what you're talking about with the presence, right? I mean, and sometimes when it comes to the presence, um, there's people that they do have to get there some way, but they don't necessarily have to take the route from unconscious competence or unconscious incompetence to unconscious competence. Some people have a talent or a presence, like you say, where it's just part of who they are, or it's evolved out of their exposure to various things, and they themselves couldn't describe to you what does it, and even the people around them is like, well, they're here and I want to play well. And so that's very interesting to me too, about how in all these domains, you could be a piano technician, right? And you could have a way of being really excellent at it without knowing what you're doing or being able to explain it. And at the same time, it is a fruitful practice to explore the facets of what makes that happen. Sometimes you can manufacture it as well. What have you found for yourself in terms of the experience of conducting and having a presence? Is it something that you just go, well, I am who I am and I conduct how I conduct, or do you try to have a presence, something you could evolve or develop? What do you think about that?
over time, I've really developed the philosophy that, I'm one of those conductors who's like a servant. I'm a servant. I consider myself to be a servant of the composer, a servant of the musicians, a servant of any soloist that's working with me. I always tell them my job's to make you look good. So whatever you want, tell me, and if it's possible, we'll do it for you. But I have tried to cultivate a presence on the podium that is just sort of like calming, and I want to embody the music rather than act like it, if that makes sense. So, when I first started conducting, I was much more concerned about practicing specific gestures that I say, well, at this spot, I think they're going to need this cue, so I'm going to do this. Now I'm much more about the gestalt of the whole thing. Like I don't prepare so much specific gestures. I just go there with the intent to be open to the moment. And what I find is, it's like a good jazz improviser. What do they practice? They practice their scales. And then when they go on stage, all of the stuff they practiced gets reformed and comes out spontaneously in something new, but they have to have the technique from which that to spring. So I think of conducting like that too. Like I've practiced all the gestures. I can cue, I can do all that, but now I'm more focused on embodying the feeling and presence of the music and giving cues where needed, but not when they're not. I think it was Bernstein who said something to the effect of, the more the music dances, the more I stand still.
Mm.
I mean,
Mm.
if you
Let it
get
happen. Don't
right,
try
if
to
you
mess with it.
don't try to interfere. If the players don't need you, don't
Mm.
jump in there. Be prepared at any moment. And this definitely happens in live performance where all of a sudden some little funky thing will go wrong and it'll be like, okay, I'm here for you. 1, 2, 3, 4, I got you. But if they don't need it, then I don't want to be interfering with their musicianship because I really respect the musicianship of the players that I work with and I value their contributions and I try to give them space in which
Mhm.
to be their greatest musician. And the sum total of all those great musicians making music together is greater than the sum of the parts.
Mhm.
And I think of myself as a channel or a vessel or a facilitator, and I'm there to try, how can I make it better than if I wasn't here? Not interference, but just, finding ways to help them collaborate and work together. And so, yeah, I do cultivate a presence, but it's more like a presence of the music and also a space, creating a space for the musicians.
Mhm. Yeah, I like that. I mean, it makes sense that in performance situations, you want to limit your thinking as much as possible. You just want to go, and that I even explained some of the things that you mentioned. Stravinsky, and he's just going, right? There's shouldn't be thinking about it, right? And that's probably the best. It's going to come out the best if you're not like, whoa, I missed that note, I missed that cue. What do I do? They just go with what your body's prepared for. But the
Yeah.
preparation is important, it sounds like.
Yeah. And
Um,
especially with soloists, you really have to be there. You have to make sure you're attentive. That concerto conducting, as I've done a lot of it, and it's one of the most challenging forms of conducting. So in those paces, I'm a lot more attentive to the flow and making sure that I'm aligning the orchestra and the soloist.
hmm. Before we go on to your doctoral thesis, whenever I hear Stravinsky, I think of this quote. It's kind of one of my favorites.
Uh-huh.
I don't know why I like it so much, but it is the more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself of the chains that shackle the spirit. Uh, have you heard that one before?
Yes, I have. I think that might be from Poetics of Music, maybe.
Hmm.
Yeah,
I've always liked that one because it's sort of, for me, it indicates how rules can lead to, rules and constraints can lead to, sort of beautiful, new, unexpected, extemporaneous creations.
I agree. I think he's kind of talking about boundaries, setting parameters within, because if you have too many choices, it's kind of overwhelming.
Mhm.
So by setting some parameters within which to work, you actually give yourself almost unlimited freedom within those boundaries. I just recently attended a conference where the composer Michael Abels was speaking, and he's done a number of films and also concert music. And he said the same thing. They asked him, like, how do you prepare to write a film score? And he's like, the first thing I do is find out what the director wants. I find out what my parameters are. And once I
Mhm.
know what my boundaries are, then I can go go to town within those boundaries, but I feel like I need and I hope I'm speaking correctly. I'm not trying to put words in his
An
mouth, but he
example. Yeah.
basically said something to the effect that, he really likes to get his boundaries established before he writes, so then he knows within the parameters what he's able to do, and it actually
Mm.
gives him some freedom. And I think Stravinsky was kind of indicating the same thing.
Mm. I love this. I know this is my interest. I'm following it here. The audience may be like, well, what are you talking about this for? I'm going to pursue it a slightly deeper and then maybe connect it to piano work. But I think it's because I'm noticing a pattern recently. I've been thinking about organizations and their structure, and actually this may connect to we might talk about your work with your orchestra and trying to promote the professional orchestra and expand it. For having guiding principles. Some people kind of balk at this and it totally with understanding, like, we value integrity and, commitment and you're like, okay, whatever. It's just some words that they came up with. But, the more I approach it and think about it, having, core values for oneself, one's organizations, one's groups, whenever you're trying to achieve something, it does exactly what you're talking about. If you don't know exactly what your values are, then you don't always know what's the next decision. There could be lots of decisions that seem great to make, but how do you pick? And I think that like that way that you put it, where it said that, there could be lots of things you can do, and it's really just about making it easier to make decisions in some ways when you have some core guiding principles and parameters. That's
Yeah,
great.
absolutely. And it's something we're actually doing with the Burbank Phil right now. We're undergoing a strategic planning process, and we've had a couple of board retreats, and that is exactly what we're doing. We're setting our mission, vision, and values, so which that sort of gives you the rules by which you're going to make your decisions. It gives you if you say, should we do this? Well, let's look and see what are our values, what's our mission, does it align with it or not? And that can be a big help to keep you in the lane you want to be in. If you say, I want to go in this lane, well, then, you don't want all of a sudden be jumping off over here somewhere. You kind of align yourself with that. I think that's really, really true.
Great. Well, I'm going to let the conversation flow as a good conductor might, a little bit extemporaneously here. I do want to hope we get back to the doctoral thesis stuff because I know that's interesting. But let's continue down this path of your work. Maybe mention the different types of orchestras that you're involved with and how you are, I know, focusing on one type of work and expanding it. And then I'd love to hear, you may be in process, but maybe some of those interesting points you've developed to guide you in your efforts there. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I do have a strong background in music education, which I'm proud of. I was actually a classroom teacher for a number of years as my day job while I was still doing all this other stuff. And so I feel like that was of great value to me because, in fact, I just heard this from one of my mentors who said he studied with Neil Thompson. He studied with Kurt Sonderling, and Sonderling told him, great conducting is great teaching. And there's a lot of connection between those two things. So, I feel like I got a lot of valuable experience and I learned a lot and I got to try a lot of things in a low pressure environment, in those settings. And I feel like I was successful in that. And now, the nice thing is I have that range of skill set. So I work with the Burbank Philharmonic as a professional orchestra, but I'm also working with a community orchestra. And, in that setting, I lean more towards the teacher side because the players aren't necessarily as advanced and we have to spend weeks, honing the music. So in that sense, I'm more leaning on my teacher side of skills. And then as we prepare the music, I go more into pure conducting mode. Very different with the professionals. We have 2 rehearsals for every concert. We go like rehearsal, rehearsal, concert. And so in those 2 days back to back, we have to accomplish everything. And so in that sense, it's a lot more about me. I know how good the players are. And so it's my job to guide them. And I'm very open to feedback. I have some fantastic principal players, particularly in the strings, who are very well experienced and seasoned players. And, when they speak up and say, Mike, right here, we need this, or if you could just give us that cue, we'll take care of the rest. By all means, I respect that. And I do what they ask because ultimately we all have the same goal, which is to make the music better. So I don't want to insist, well, I think I know the way to do it. If my concert master says, I need this from you right here, I say, okay, Carolyn, you got it, and I do it. So there's that sort of give and take with the musicians, but also I really have to put a lot more trust in them. And there's not a lot of specific things I have to stop for versus in a community group where I'm stopping to work maybe on a certain intonation issue or a balance or a rhythm. With the professionals, you say that spot there was out of tune, fix it next time, and they do because of the kind of players that they are. And that's a real thrill. And I've even found that with the two rehearsals and the concert is always without doubt the finest run through of the pieces. Like it builds. In some ways, the sophomore slump idea. Like we have a first rehearsal, things go great. Second rehearsal, this is where we start working stuff out. Come back for that concert, and the players take it to the next level because they're professionals. And and with the community players, I still find that happens, but it's just a much longer process. And so I can kind of go back and forth among the range of skills that I have to see what does each group need and then give them what they need, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Let's skip over a little bit to your experience with pianos, pianists, piano technicians.
Uh-huh.
That's our primary audience here. Um, what has been your experience in terms of that domain?
Well, I'm not a pianist by training. I wish I
Hmm.
was, but I'm not. But yeah, my experience, I mean, I've conducted a number of piano solos and had wonderful experiences working with those musicians. And I think I was mentioning to you before that, in my studies, in my undergrad and my master's, um, I usually ended up sort of getting to know the piano techs for whatever reason. I just found them really interesting people. And as I've grown older, I've also become really interested and just fascinated with mechanical devices, of which I would consider the piano to be sort of an early mechanical device. I even had a class where we talked about the evolution of the piano from the harpsichord through the clavichord to the piano, how the action was developed, all that stuff. And I just found it endlessly fascinating, the way in a time before computers and stuff, the way craftsmen were able to figure out how to dial these things in and get the nuances without the aid of computer aided design or anything like that. There's something palpable about that physical instrument that I really respect someone who has that intuitive sort of kinesthetic sense about them.
Mm,
And I found piano techs to be often sort of, not always, but often sort of very like quiet, introspective, very focused people. And I think, because if you're going to fine tune a piano, you really got to be able to focus and hone in on the most subtle things that 99% of people wouldn't notice, but you and the pianist who's going to play that piano notice those things.
mm.
I remember in my master's getting access to the piano lab, and I was just fascinated because I walk in and there'd be like an action sitting on the workbench and tools. And then there was this whole wall of like those little bins with parts. And I thought, how amazing that they know all this stuff. And, it's like a fine auto mechanic or anybody who's really good with kinesthetic stuff that they could be like, oh, I need this exact thing. And they know how to work with it. And I really appreciate that about folks like that. And I've enjoyed getting to know some of them.
Appreciate that. Yes, it is. It's a lot more complicated than it seems on the surface.
Yeah. I can
And
only imagine because I don't know, but I really have an appreciation for people's abilities to do that sort of work, and especially when it involves physical, manipulatable items. And like, how do you get, my wife had a longtime piano tuner that would tune the pianos for her choir where she teaches. And he was such a fascinating guy. He was one of those guys that tunes by ear, which I love. So he would be in there counting beats and he just had this way of assessing the instrument. And then when I would need help, I'd call him and he'd come whatever instrument and he would say, Mike, this is not worth da 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 da, but I can do this for you or that for you. So that sensibility of like knowing your craft and being really good at it is something that I really respect in any profession.
mm, any analogs to the tuning the orchestra, or I'm sure I'm sure the orchestra in some senses tunes itself tonally.
Yeah.
Um, but have you noticed any nuances to how you get the musicians in tune with each other, less in terms of the frequencies, but working together as a cohort.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I've actually another thing that I've always been I'm fascinated by is the whole concept of the development of the tuning systems and equal temperament, and this idea that the piano is perfectly out of tune because it has to be in order to work in all 12 keys, right?
Mm,
So, orchestras tune by tuning to the overtone series. So,
mhm,
in that sense, like if you were to play, say, a chorale on the piano, you would have to accept that it's going to be it's going to have its out of tuneness because that's the way the instrument has to be tuned to be versatile in modern music, right? And whereas in an orchestra, and being a player in orchestra, I especially love playing inner parts in the French horn section. Like it's the harmony within the harmony. If I'm playing second or third or whatever, it's that adjustment of like when you hit a chord, then everybody, boom, they drop the third 14 cents and they raise the fifth 2 cents and they lock in those chords. And I don't know if you've ever played with a Yamaha Harmony Director keyboard or you know what that is.
no, tell
Oh,
me.
this is a fascinating instrument. Yamaha came up with this instrument that I started using in teaching to where it can in real time tune to just intonation. Or, in other words, adjust. So like if you play a chord, you can have it set to equal temperament and you'll hear the chord go wah 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 pulsating, right? And then you hit the other button and it goes boom and it perfectly aligns all the notes into the overtones by making those adjustments that instrumentalists and singers do kind of, once you know how to do it, you do it instinctively. And it can make those adjustments and you'll hear the chord go from this like, oh, that's okay, that's fine to boom. And
Mm-hmm.
everything locks into the overtones and it's incredible. So
Mm,
I think, with the orchestra, it's more about they just really have to be listening to each other. And, they're good musicians. And I always tell them this, like, you guys are good musicians. You know what to do. Just do it. Don't wait for me to stop and say, hey, that's out of tune. Like you take care of it because you know what you're doing. And if there's something still that lingers, then I can point it out to you. With students, you do that more. You have to teach them what in tune sounds like and get them to do it. And with the professionals, they sort of, it's just like you said about the cohesiveness of the unit. If they're all attuned to each other, and if I'm creating a space in which they feel free to make music, then they're going to take care of 95, 96% of that on their own, which I think
mm,
is a beautiful thing.
mm. Yeah. I actually, I played a little saxophone, a little trumpet, in my like grade school, high school time. Um, but I never really got into the specific domains of, you know, if you're playing a chord with a group of horns, for example, how do you each person adjust their pitch? And I was always, especially as a piano technician, hearing like a saxophone quartet or like a horn quartet or something like that. And you do hear a specific quality to the chords where it is like, well, that sounds different than a piano chord. There's something a way that they're adjusting their pitches, which gives it a specific quality. Um, how much of that is intentional versus versus intuitive in terms of tuning the various pitches when you'll play chords with a horn or something like that.
Yeah, I think most of it really boils down to musicianship. Like the better your ears are, the better, the more specifically you can hear the intonation issues. Um, but then, with singing, I think it's more intuitive because the voice will just go there. If I'm playing
Mm,
my instrument, I might have to lip the note down, or in the case of the French horn, I can cover the bell a little bit more and bring it. So I'm constantly, as a player, just listening to my first chair, and
mm,
everybody's tuning up the line to the principal player. And it's just a matter of the thing is the instrument gets in the way a little bit because then you have to physically manipulate this mechanical object in order to make it do what your ear's telling you should do. Like, oh, I'm sharp here, I got to bring it down. But then you have to know your instrument and like, how do I actually do that? And you have choices. You can use the embouchure, you can use on woodwinds, you can use alternate fingerings, things like that. So I would say it's a little bit more challenging on instruments, and also it has to do with the idiosyncrasies of the instrument itself, because every instrument, like wind instruments, they all have good notes and bad notes, which doesn't exist on the piano. They're all equal, right? But
mhm,
like on a saxophone, a D is sharp, so you have to lip it down before you even play it. It's already 20 cents sharp. What do I have to do? So I tell the students a lot. I'll be like, the difference between you and professionals is not in your ability; it's in how fast you can do it. Because I guarantee you a professional would adjust that note before they play it because they know their
Mm,
and they would be
mm,
able to slot it in. Whereas you, I hear you hit it, realize you're out of tune, and then make an adjustment, which might take a second or two in real time.
mm,
But like all you need to do is just get faster and you need to know your instrument to the point where you can make the adjustment like a professional will do before you even sound the note. You're already aware of the tendencies and you're going to slot it in so it comes out so no one else will hear it. No one will know.
mhm. Thank you for that. That's great. I know there's something about I don't know if this is for all piano tuners, but I am kind of like obsessed with tuning, and like if I get a guitar, I'm like,
Mm.
most guitar players are just going to tune that up. I'm like, well, how did you get a guitar tuned really nicely or whatever? So I appreciate you going into detail there. Um, I'd love to maybe share a clip of some of your work. We do have a few that we could potentially get to. We have one with you with the Burbank Phil, Beethoven Symphony Number 7. Maybe we'll check out like a minute of that. Any preface you'd like to include before we get going on it?
Beethoven 7 is just one of the greatest symphonies ever, and I was thrilled out of my mind to be conducting it and really enjoyed, especially this opening. Yeah, that you're going to see.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll catch about a minute of it. Wonderful introduction.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm realizing it's actually a little bit distracting to watch a conductor sometimes because you're wanting like a physical representation of the music in real time, but in actuality you're like one step ahead. Right?
Yes, as a conductor, you always have to be ahead of the ensemble. And you'll notice that I'm doing some things there to like at the end there when the 16th notes come in, before they do it, I'm thinking yet to kind of I had a teacher that talked about if you hear it in your mind the way you want it, super, super strongly, it actually projects somehow subliminally to the musicians, whether that's tuning or rhythm.
Mhm.
Like, if you can hear that chord so perfectly in tune in your mind, it sort of projects out subliminally like that. And you'll notice that I was doing a few balance things just as subtly as I could, like maybe we practice it in rehearsal and we get the certain balance, and then in the performance, if it's not how I remembered, I just kind of remind them like, hey, remember, you're going to be soft and underneath the woodwind solos or whatever. I try not to do too much of that in a performance, but sometimes it's just sort of a way to sort of remind the players, hey, remember what we did, okay? And then they go back to it like that. So
Mm. Maybe take a second to talk about the role of a conductor. We actually have had a few people who are taking on conducting roles on the program recently, so it's interesting to sort of compare. Um, Interestingly, we've seen just incidentally a handful of people who have gotten into conducting not intentionally. It's like, oh, they did some music directing or they're a pianist or something, and all of a sudden they're sort of falling into this domain. Um, what are the what are the duties of a conductor in your mind? What do you see? Like, what are the things that you're responsible for? And then maybe
everything
we'll talk everything.
in a nutshell, everything, right? Well, let's see, um, I think that the duties of the conductor just kind, yeah, you're kind of responsible for the overall and the nitty gritty at the same time. You have to be prepared to dive into the details when necessary, but at the same time, you're really trying to create an overarching vision of like a whole movement, a whole symphony, and where each movement fits. And then ultimately, I like to program a concert as if it was a multi-movement work of its own. So there's a whole set of responsibility of programming, but like let's have a fast, bright opening, and then we'll have something slow, and then we'll have something very contrasting, and then we'll end with something big and grand. Like I want the audience to feel like the program itself has been programmed for their to help them with their listening. I like the joke. I sort of like I subscribe to the ADD philosophy of programming, which is, if I would be bored listening to it, I don't want to put it in front of my audience. And so I try to juxtapose variety a lot in my programming.
Hmm.
But as far as the duties of the conductor, first and foremost, you're there to help the musicians, when you have a group that big, get through the music and be together. Because originally it started out with small groups, and the concert master or the harpsichord player would lead from the keyboard or from their chair. And then it got to the point where the music was too big and complex, and you needed somebody to coordinate everything. I think the conductor has the ultimate responsibility for interpretation of the music, and as I mentioned, I will take input from the musicians if they feel strongly about a certain thing. But ultimately, I'm sort of like, if there's going to be a choice to be made, I've got to be the final say of this is how, at this moment in my life, I believe this is how this should go. So this is the way we're going to do it, not to disrespect or discount somebody else's opinion. And, in 5 years, if I did the piece again, I might make a different choice. You just don't know. So though there's that aspect to it, yeah, there's just a whole lot of things that come into play, each of which is like a conversation unto itself in a way.
Yeah, I'm reflecting on a recent specific conversation I had. Just want to sort of check in with your perspective. The fellow was explaining how intrigued or unexpected it was for him as he got into conducting, finding out how much of it was not as much the sort of performance of the conducting on the moment and being able to organize and rehearse the orchestra and be sort of like a project manager almost for the whole thing. Yes, of course you have the live thing, but really like organizational skills, for the rehearsals and what to rehearse and all this stuff seems like it's a big part of the job,
It is a big part, and that's one of the parts that usually doesn't get talked about or taught specifically very much. Yeah,
right? It's
because
not just about moving a baton.
oh no, that's the gravy. That's the icing on the cake. You have to do all that organizing and prep work to get to that moment where you're allowed to, enjoy the performance of it. Yeah, I learned that early because, I knew I wanted to conduct starting in high school. And so after my first year of undergrad, I actually formed my own ensemble. And that was a trial by fire of learning how to. I did everything myself at that point because I was new at it, and I learned a lot from that experience. But yes, there's a huge amount of prep work, organization, um, logistics that goes into it, and then preparing, for rehearsal, like you say, what to rehearse, when, things like that. There's a lot of administrative stuff that has to be taken care of so you can get to that point.
Hmm. Yeah, in many ways, it sounds like there's many unromantic parts of being a conductor.
There, there are a lot. The parts that nobody sees, but that are absolutely necessary in order to get to the part that everyone does see.
Yes. Um, and then specifically, oh, I just had an interesting sort of thought experiment question for you. What would it be like in your mind for, you've rehearsed the orchestra, you're getting them ready for a few weeks, you're this big performance. What would it be like for someone else to just come in and do the actual live conducting? Would that just be almost like a train wreck, or would it be possible? Does that happen ever? Yeah, what are your
It
thoughts on
does. I
that?
mean, the famous story about how Leonard Bernstein filled in for an ailing conductor, and then, he blasted to fame overnight from that. I think a lot
Hmm.
depends on the person.
Hmm.
It depends on the individual that, let's say I suddenly was ill and someone had to fill in for me. A lot of it is like the prep. So like if I've done my job well to prepare the group, they should be able to do the performance pretty much without me. Like in other words, I've done 90% of the work in the rehearsals and the preparation.
Hmm.
Um, it also depends on the level of players. The higher level, more professional players can do more and more on their own. Whereas students, for example, they sort of get trained to do it a certain way, and the younger they are, the less flexibility they will have with a new conductor, unless you really train them on it.
Mm.
Like if you take a beginning band, and I could put anybody up in front of a beginner band, they're going to put their heads down and play it the same way they always play it, because that's just how it goes at that age, at that level, right? But a great orchestra can be led by the concertmaster if necessary. If a subconductor came in and was giving conflicting gestures, the orchestra might all just look at the concertmaster's bow and decide, well, we're just going to go with what we rehearsed in
Mm.
this case. But if that subconductor has a great, strong presence and projects it out, then they will be able to modify that in real time with their energy and their presence and the force of their personality. They will be able to take that energy and be like, nope, we're going over here, guys, and you're going to follow me, and they will do it. So there's infinite levels of subtlety that would come into play when somebody new steps on the podium. But it does make a difference, because people often say, and I see these videos on YouTube about, what difference does the conductor make? Well, let me tell you, if you put a different conductor up there, you will get a different sound out of that group.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
It will change the sound. It will change everything about it.
Mm. That makes a lot of sense. Um, all right, I want to get back to something that happened earlier. Your
Okay.
thesis project and the doctoral thesis. Tell us what that's all about. I want to hear more, at least dive a little bit into it before we
Okay.
forget about
Well,
it.
what I did with my doctoral project is I'm very interested in diversity within the orchestral world, both in terms of diversifying the players of the orchestra, but also, playing music by composers that have traditionally been pushed to the side. So I set out, basically my goal was, I want to find a hidden gem, a piece that has been lost to history by a composer from an historically underrepresented group, and I want to bring it back to life and bring it into the mainstream, and hopefully have it become a new piece in the repertoire.
Mm.
So I set out looking for, and specifically I was looking for Black composers, but I was open to whatever. But I was looking, and I went in search of like a piece that was nobody knew, that had been played once and forgotten, or maybe had never been played at all. And so I did a lot of searching. I looked in bibliographies, and I honed in on the Free Library of Philadelphia, which is a wonderful place where they have the largest collection of orchestra scores and parts for loan in the entire country, if not the world.
Mm.
And so they have all these pieces there, and orchestras are able to, borrow this music, perform it, and send it back for a nominal fee. And I went in, and I had a few composers in mind, and I went there last summer, and I went through their archives, and I honed in on a Black conductor, choral conductor, excuse me, pianist by the name of R. Nathaniel Dett, who most people have not heard about, but he was 100 years ago an extremely important and prominent musician in America. He was a concert pianist. He was a composer. His main claim to fame as far as a conductor was that he led the choirs at the Hampton Institute, what is now Hampton University in Virginia, which is an HBCU. And he built those choirs over 19 years into a phenomenal. It was modeled kind of on the Fisk Jubilee Singers. People have often heard of the Fisk
Mhm.
Jubilee Singers. It was very much in that exact vein. And his peak of that was that in 1930, George Foster Peabody and John D. Rockefeller, they organized and funded a European tour where he took his choir on a tour of 7 European countries, performed for the Queen of England, for the Queen of Belgium, and just got rave reviews, not just for performing spirituals, which was the kind of their specialty, but just performing all kinds of music. And he apparently just had this really incredible ability to mold and manipulate a choir into singing incredibly well. And they played in Carnegie Hall and Symphony Hall in Chicago, and then they did this European tour. Well, so I found out that he actually did a little bit of orchestral writing or orchestrations, and I discovered this particular piece which he had made an orchestration of, and it was never published. He published the piano suite, but he never published the orchestration. It had been sitting in this library since 1939 or 1940. And so I was able to get it. and brought it home. And I went in my computer notation software, Finale, and I input the whole thing and then come to discover, well, there's a lot of loose ends in this piece. So then I'm doing a critical commentary and making edits, corrections, things that, I can look at the piano version and see, well, there's some wrong notes here. These are obvious wrong notes. And then there's other things where I have to make editorial decisions about, what do I think he wanted here? Or just the fact that huge portions of it had no dynamics. So then I'm looking, going, well, what does the piano part say here? Okay, what seems like a appropriate dynamic? And then balancing, like, okay, it's a solo cello, give them mezzo forte and the accompaniment all piano, because otherwise we won't hear it, stuff like that. So I've undertaken this process of basically reconstructing this piece. And to my knowledge, it was never performed. It was checked out a couple times from the library, but I don't think anyone performed it. And seeing how many mistakes and stuff were in the manuscript, I highly doubt it would be performable that well in its current state anyways. So I could see why someone would read it and send it back, because there was a lot of mistakes in it.
Mm-hmm.
But my goal is, I'm going to take this piece out and perform it and publish it and record it with the hopes that other orchestras will pick up on it and it could become part of the repertoire, add another piece by a diverse composer to the repertoire that orchestras all over the world could perform. That's my goal and my gift to the orchestra world is let's resurrect this piece that's worthy and bring it back to being performable and get it performed.
Wonderful. I love that. Yeah, we've had a few people on the program in various, you know, niches that are doing similar things, maybe bringing forth a lesser known composer, performing their works, or sort of uh, interpreting them. We also had Christian Benitez. He's a Latin Grammy winning piano player, and and he is passionate about bringing the music of his home country, Venezuela, to the fore, right? And yeah, well, that's great. I deeply resonate with diversity, an appreciation for diversity, and in any ways that we can, reaching out to things that are unfamiliar to us or our communities, and trying to, comprehend them, present them, share them. So I applaud you for that as a topic. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, okay, well, we are getting very close to the end of the hour. There's been a lot of wonderful things to talk about. I appreciate your presence and your insights. Um, we'll ask to share where to find out more about you soon. Anything that you're thinking we sort of missed and maybe we should at least mention in before we head out.
No, I think we covered a lot of really good ground. I'm just all about, I guess the one thing I could say is, this idea of intentionality and being committed to creating your dreams no matter how long it takes, because you hear about this from people, like I had a day job for a long time and it took me 20 years till I got to the point where I felt like I could launch out and do this alone. And it's challenging and at times it's frustrating and discouraging, but at the same time, it's just, never give up. I was inspired, particularly, I'll mention, by when I was teaching high school, by this choral conductor by the name of Vance George. He was the conductor of the San Francisco Symphony Chorus at the time. And I went to he gave a presentation or a lecture at a conference or whatever. And when I heard him say, yeah, I used to teach high school, I went, it's possible. My dream of being a professional conductor, if this guy could do it, I can do it too. And I've always, continued to stay up with education. I love going to conducting workshops and summer programs. And I've always made sure that I've kept my foot in that door and tried to continually improve myself, my musicianship, my conducting, my craft, just over time, knowing that this is going to happen for me one day. And right now I'm excited because it is actually happening. And it's amazing, and I'm getting the chance to conduct these world-class musicians, and we're doing premieres and pieces by diverse composers. And so I just want to put a plug in there for the belief that if you believe you can do it, you can really make it happen. And it may take a long time. I have a friend who's an actor and he got his first, Oscar nomination when he was in his 70s. It's like you
Hmm.
just never give up. If you know you're good, eventually it'll happen for you, and you just keep plugging away. And that's I appreciate being able to be on this program because it's exciting to feel like, all of this stuff is happening with that vision and intentionality.
Wonderful. I have a few things to follow up with there, just off the top of my head. So I appreciate you bringing up the topic before we roll out. Number one, a book I came across recently, which I'm getting through, called "Real Artists Don't Starve," and it's the main one of the main topics of the book is following Michelangelo Buonarroti and his various relationships to money and within his profession, and um, actually being quite a wealthy person ultimately, and having strategies to kind of do his art but still make ends meet and flourish. And I think that's important to follow these stories. I think it's so easy to look back historically at various artists and sort of pigeonhole what an artist is, what an artist does, what they did or did not do that wasn't so romantic, because it's so easy when somebody's got this great au revoir that, or over, is that how you say it? Like
That's right.
yeah, yeah, they're kind of like their body of work and it's so amazing, and you miss the little sketches or the mistakes or the trip ups or whatever. There's a lot to it. So that's one thing that made me think of. The other thing is the biography of Leonardo da Vinci by Walter Isaacson. There were some moments that were particularly poignant for me where Leonardo is actually negotiating with people who want to buy his work.
Uh-huh.
And it just feels arduous, It's like, oh, they said they wanted it, but then they weren't paying and they were trying to bargain him down and he had to fight for the value of it and all this stuff. And like again, this is just like any of our lives, who's trying to just make it work as an artist. These are just it's less romantic, and but that actually can make it more romantic for you. I think can make it more engaging and more exciting to participate in the day to day of what it means to be an artist, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I've had to develop those skills for myself because, when you're a teacher, there's a salary table and there's no negotiation, right? But then when you're out on your own, you're always about, well, what am I worth? What do I think I'm worth? And, learning to, just ask for what I want or what I think I believe that I should get. And I can see why people have agents because it can be challenging to do that for yourself. But at the same time, it's a little bit self-empowering when I realize, yeah, I can actually ask for that. And if they say no, okay, well, we'll negotiate or whatever. But believing that I can do it and always, working just to keep a lot of things, a lot of different jobs going so that I can diversify, I guess that is the watchword these days, diverse income streams I hear people talk about, so stuff like that. But yeah, I think it's important to just get through those nitty gritty moments to get to the good stuff.
Appreciate that. Appreciate you sharing that. All right, we'll be signing off here momentarily. Do you want to send people someplace to find out more about you, like a website or a social handle, or should I just Google you? What's your
Uh,
suggestion?
my website, michaelstanleymusic.com, is a place that you can go, and my LinkedIn. Those are the two biggest ones right now. Um, I actually went off social media to finish my doctorate, so I've been off
Good
there
for
for a
you.
little while. I
Good for
said,
you.
I got it around March. I was like, if I don't need any more distractions, right? So I kind of went off that. I have a LinkedIn and I have my website. So those are a couple places that people can find.
Beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. Thanks for sharing your social media about your social media diet
Sure.
as well. That's could
Put
be
it in there.
inspirational. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. We've reached the end of another musical journey here at Piano Tech Radio Hour. Michael Stanley again, pleasure to have you. As always, we're brought to you by Piano Technicians Masterclasses, cutting edge instruction from piano industry masters without leaving your home. For those of you that joined us today by signing up for this session individually, you can make your life more convenient. You can subscribe to Piano Tech Radio Hour at just $16 a month. You get the recording of today's session in our member area, as well as automatic registration for each week's new session. Sign up at bit.ly/joinptrh. That's bit.ly/joinptrh. And of course, remember to check out the podcast, the pianotechradio.com, the blog on Substack, as well as our various social media channels, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and you just Google us and you can find us. Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you again next week. Appreciate you so much for joining us today. Bye-bye.